For more insights on this trip and the rest of the entire trip in Latin America, I'm joined by Margaret Myers, Program Director of China and Latin America think tank at the Inter-American Dialogue. It's good to see you again. Thank you.
Good to see you too.
Thank you for being here. Let me first ask, is it politics or is it economics? Because 3 of the places that President Xi is visiting actually doesn't have U.S. embassies, and it's hard to ignore that aspect of the trip.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and quite a few analysts have made the assertion that, China is going to these countries. In this case, it's Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, and Cuba. In some ways, as a challenge to the U.S. presence in the Pacific, specifically in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and perceived U.S. interference there. It's my perception that this trip is primarily economic in nature, just as it has been for many years now, dating back to nearly a decade ago.
We joke about the U.S. pivot to Asia. Is this the Latin America pivot for China?
That's what some are saying, and certainly there's a lot written about the Monroe Doctrine in Chinese. But in all honesty, these are countries that Chinese presidents have visited now for years. Each of these countries has received up to 5 or 6 visits since about 2006 from China's supreme leader. So it's nothing new or really groundbreaking in this case. It's been happening for quite some time.
All right, let's talk about the economics. China, traditionally, it's always been about buying things. In other words, China needs commodities or resources from Latin America, and that was a simple idea, and in turn Latin America would buy finished goods from China.
Right.
How has that relationship changed, and perhaps how might that shift the conversation that they're having right now?
That's still the fundamental dynamic in most all of these countries, and that's particularly an issue among South nations. But what has changed is at least the rhetoric, and we see some examples of China investing in strategic sectors and value-added sectors and research and development facilities in countries like Brazil, and this is at the bequest of leaders like Dilma Rousseff in Brazil and some others that have really expressed concerns about trade balance and trade imbalances in particular. So there are some changes, and I think there's a real recognition on the part of the Chinese leadership that things have to change somewhat, at least in terms of trade and investment, for there to be a long-term and productive presence in the region.
When you think strategically, if you're based in Latin America and you're advising Latin American governments, obviously China is a very big player, but what do these countries want from China? I guess the other way around.
Yeah, they want investment, certainly, and there is quite a bit of foreign direct investment going into these countries, but it tends to be in specific sectors. Infrastructure, which we're seeing a lot of right now in Brazil, and there will be some big deals in Argentina as well, but also raw materials related sectors, and they want investment in a wider variety of sectors, perhaps in manufacturing and research and services and other sectors that are seen as promoting longer term growth in these economies.
It's hard to ignore the fact that China is building stronger relations with Latin America, and I guess from a U.S. perspective, does that warrant any reaction from the U.S. side?
It's interesting because, it all depends on who you're talking about in the U.S. government. Certainly, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has very little concern about this. They say what's good for Latin America, and China is good for Latin America in economic terms, generally speaking, is also good for the U.S. It builds a very strong Western Hemisphere and a very strong region. But China's deals are massive and impressive, and that really presents a challenge to the U.S. in terms of public perception at the very least.
Well, they are big deals. Let me just focus on one more country here, Cuba, because we've had such an awkward relationship with Cuba, the United States. Some would argue there really isn't a relationship, but there really is one. There's been a lot of talk about that loosening up, that becoming a bit more formal, and that relationship perhaps becoming more fruitful. Is this hopeful thinking?
Between
the U.S. and Cuba.
The U.S. and Cuba, well, that's a process. There's been talk about that for years now. What's interesting is that China, obviously has a very close relationship with Cuba, and that's a real outlier in that it really is an ideological and historically based relationship, especially in comparison to some of these others. And any movement that we'll see in terms of Cuba opening or economic liberalization in Cuba is probably going to be the result of Chinese influence. China for years now has been pushing Cuba to liberalize its economy, to do the sorts of economic reforms that China implemented in the reform and opening up period. So it's quite interesting that might be what changes Cuba's outlook more than anything else.
basically, whatever China is doing, economically, politically, it's working. It's working for them, right?
There are certainly challenges. There are certainly challenges, but China is a growing presence in the region and an important one by all accounts.
All right. Margaret Myers, thank you very much. Have a great weekend. Thank you for your analysis.